She called me a nobody, a leech, a housewife who manipulated our dying father. My sister Victoria stood in that courtroom, designer heels clicking against marble, addressing 200 of Boston's legal elite with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. She wanted them all to witness my humiliation, to watch the useless older sister crumble under the weight of real lawyers, real power, real success. The judge's gavel hadn't even fallen when everything changed. I'm Margaret, 42 years old, and if you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This is the story of how my own sister tried to steal my $50 million inheritance, why she thought she could destroy me in court, and what happened when the judge suddenly stood up, his voice shaking. Judge Thompson? Margaret? Is it really you? She had no idea who she was really suing. The Thompson family of Beacon Hill was everything old Boston society aspired to be. Our father, Charles Thompson, ran the largest private bank in Massachusetts. Our mother died when I was 12 and Victoria was 8, leaving Dad to raise two daughters with vastly different definitions of success. Victoria collected achievements like designer handbags, Harvard Law, summa cum laude, law review editor, recruited by 3 white shoe firms before graduation. She kept every award, every accolade, framed in her office like hunting trophies. Dad would introduce her at country club dinners. My daughter Victoria, senior partner at Hayes & Associates. The pride in his voice could fill Symphony Hall. Then there was me. Margaret helps with the family, he'd say, his tone softer, almost apologetic. What he didn't mention, what I made sure he never mentioned, was that I'd graduated from Yale Law, a year before Victoria even took her LSATs. That my bar exam score remained the highest in Massachusetts for 3 consecutive years. That at 29, I was reading briefs for the Federal Circuit Court. But Victoria needed to be the star. She'd lost Mom young, thrown herself into excellence as armor against grief. I understood that hunger, that desperate need for validation. So I let her have the spotlight. I learned to smile when relatives praised her brilliance while asking if I'd found a husband yet. I perfected the art of being forgettable. Our family photos told the story. Victoria in sharp focus, crimson lipstick and power poses, while I lingered at the edges, beige cardigan and neutral expression. The Tiffany frames on Dad's mantel held her Harvard graduation, her first court victory, her wedding to David Hayes. Mine held a single photo from a family barbecue, my face half turned from the camera. Nobody questioned why I kept my achievements hidden. After all, some sacrifices are too precious to advertise. 10 years ago, everything changed with a phone call at 3 in the morning. Dad had collapsed at his office, rushed to Mass General. The diagnosis came like a judge's verdict. Parkinson's disease, stage 3, aggressive progression expected. Victoria flew in from New York where she was building her reputation as a corporate litigation shark. She stayed exactly 36 hours, long enough to hire a home care agency and lecture me about not letting Dad manipulate me with guilt. I'm at a critical point in my career, she explained, checking her phone between sentences. This Johnson merger could make me the youngest senior partner in the firm's history. I sat in that hospital room, watching Dad's hands tremble as he tried to sign a document, and made a decision that would define the next decade of my life. The resignation letter I submitted to the Federal Circuit Court was 2 sentences long. Chief Judge Patterson called me personally, then showed up at my apartment. Margaret, you're on track for the appeals court. Hell, there's talk of a Supreme Court clerkship. Don't throw this away. But I'd already boxed up my law books, stored my court robes in the back of my closet, behind winter coats I'd never wear again. The Mercedes S-Class keys went into my jewelry box, replaced by the keys to Dad's old Volvo. I told everyone I was taking a sabbatical to help with family matters. The lie became easier each time. Victoria never asked why I was suddenly always available. Never wondered how a woman with just a bachelor's degree could navigate Dad's complex medical insurance appeals, negotiate with specialists, or understand the legal implications of his deteriorating capacity. She was too busy to notice the Federal Circuit Court seal on papers. I quickly shuffled away whenever she visited. Some sacrifices are too precious to advertise. Some are too painful to explain. The next 10 years unfolded in routines that would have broken Victoria's manicured nails. Morning medications at 6, 17 pills sorted into a weekly organizer. Physical therapy at 8, watching Dad struggle to maintain dignity while relearning to button his shirt. Afternoons reading legal briefs aloud, not for my benefit, but because Dad's mind remained sharp even as his body betrayed him, and discussing case law kept him anchored to who he used to be. Victoria visited 3 times a year, always with photographer-ready timing. Thanksgiving for the family photos she'd post on LinkedIn. Dad's birthday for the touching daughter-father moment her firm would feature in their diversity report. Christmas Eve for exactly 4 hours, leaving before Christmas morning because David's family had traditions that couldn't be broken. She never saw the nights Dad couldn't sleep, pacing the halls while I followed with a blanket. Never witnessed him crying from frustration when he couldn't sign his own name. Never held the basin while he was sick from medication adjustments, or spent 17 hours in the emergency room after a bad fall. But Dad saw everything. During our late-night conversations, when the medication made him unusually clear, we'd discuss constitutional law, corporate malfeasance, the evolution of fiduciary duty. "You should have been on the Supreme Court by now," he said once, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm exactly where I need to be," I replied, adjusting his blanket. 3 years before he died, Dad made a phone call to his personal attorney. Not the family lawyer Victoria knew, but James Morrison from Morrison and Associates, who specialized in bulletproof estate planning. I wasn't in the room, but I heard Dad's voice through the door. "I want this ironclad, James. Every contingency covered." Justice isn't always found in courtrooms. Sometimes it's written in wills. Dad passed on a Tuesday morning in March, holding my hand while spring rain drummed against the windows. His last words were, "Thank you, Maggie." Victoria was in Tokyo, closing a merger. She made it back for the funeral, delivered a eulogy about his professional legacy that sounded like a LinkedIn post, then stayed to handle the estate matters. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday at Morrison and Associates offices. Victoria arrived with David and 2 junior associates from their firm, treating it like a business meeting. She'd already mentally allocated Dad's $50 million estate. The houses, the investment portfolio, the bank shares. "Margaret can have Mom's jewelry and maybe the cottage in Maine," she'd told David over breakfast, loud enough for me to hear. "It's only fair, considering I've been carrying the family reputation." James Morrison adjusted his reading glasses and began with the standard preamble. Then he reached Article 3. "To my daughter Margaret Thompson, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all real property, financial instruments, and equity positions valued at approximately $50 million. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before David's briefcase hit the floor. "To my daughter Victoria Thompson Hayes," Morrison continued, his voice steady, "I leave the sum of $1 million, subject to the conditions outlined in Article 7, Section B." Victoria's face cycled through confusion, rage, then cold calculation. "This is fraud," David announced, already standing. "Charles Thompson wasn't mentally competent. My wife is his successful daughter, not—" He gestured at me dismissively. "A housewife who's never worked a day in her life." Morrison slid a document across the mahogany table. The will was dated 3 years ago, when Dad was completely lucid, with 2 witnesses and a notary seal. But it was the section David hadn't let Morrison finish reading that would matter most later. The letter arrived on Hayes and Associates' letterhead, the gold embossing so thick I could feel it through the envelope. 5 pages of legal threats wrapped in professional language: undue influence, elder abuse, fraudulent manipulation of a vulnerable adult. They demanded I relinquish all claims to the estate to avoid costly litigation that would tarnish our father's memory. "Sign this, Margaret," Victoria said, appearing at my door the next morning with a settlement agreement. Take the million Dad left you in the main cottage. That's more than generous for someone who's never contributed anything meaningful to this family. I need time to review this, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Review it? David laughed from behind her. With what legal expertise? Your community college paralegal certificate? They assumed a housewife would crumble at legal letterhead. They assumed intimidation would work, because it always had. Victoria had been bulldozing me since childhood, taking my toys, my friends, my spotlight, while I stepped aside to keep the peace. What they didn't know was that my bar license was still active. Number 2847, maintained every year through continuing education credits I completed online at 3 in the morning while Dad slept. Just a formality, I told myself. Personal reasons. I won't sign anything under duress, I said, using the legal term deliberately. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Don't try to sound smart, Margaret. This is real law, not whatever you've picked up from watching TV. The next letter came from 3 firms simultaneously. Hayes and Associates had called in favors. They wanted to bury me in paper, drain me with legal fees before we ever reached a courtroom. The strategy was textbook. Overwhelm the weak opponent into submission. They didn't know I'd once written the textbook on estate litigation defense. Literally, Chapter 17 of Massachusetts inheritance law bore my name, though the publisher had long since forgotten. Victoria's campaign began at the Brookline Country Club's spring gala. I heard about it from Mrs. Chen, who'd overheard Victoria holding court near the bar, surrounded by Boston's legal wives. Poor Daddy wasn't himself those last years, Victoria said, her voice carrying perfectly. Margaret took advantage of his confusion. It breaks my heart, but what else could explain him leaving everything to someone who never even finished using her law degree? By the next week, I couldn't buy groceries without feeling eyes on me. The family accountant stopped returning my calls. Dad's golf buddies crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. David leveraged every connection, ensuring that any lawyer I might approach would mysteriously have conflicts of interest. They wanted me isolated, desperate, ready to settle for scraps, rather than face public humiliation. Victoria posted old photos on Instagram, her in her judge's robes from moot court, me in an apron at Thanksgiving. The caption read, "Missing Dad and hoping family can heal. Hashtag estate planning. Family first. Hashtag justice." But while they performed their show for Boston society, I was making my own quiet preparations. A single email to an address I hadn't used in a decade. Robert, it's Margaret Thompson. I may need to appear in your courtroom soon. Fair warning. The response came within an hour. Judge Thompson, I wondered when you'd resurface. The Massachusetts legal community has a long memory. I printed that email and filed it with the other documents I was gathering. Bank statements showing my power of attorney, properly executed. Medical records documenting Dad's cognitive evaluations, all showing competency when the will was signed. And something else. Something Victoria didn't know existed. A video Dad had recorded with Morrison, explaining his decisions in painful detail. Silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And I'd been strategizing for longer than they knew. The lawsuit arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered by a process server who looked embarrassed. 200 pages of accusations, demanding a jury trial, filed in Suffolk County Superior Court. But Victoria had made a calculated move. She requested the proceedings be public in the interest of transparency and to protect other vulnerable elders from similar exploitation. She wanted an audience for my destruction. The legal filing made the Boston Globe's business section. Banking heiress challenges father's will ran alongside a photo of Victoria outside the courthouse, designer sunglasses, and practiced concern. David had assembled a team of 5 attorneys from 3 firms. They'd booked Courtroom 1, the historical chamber with 300 gallery seats, usually reserved for cases of significant public interest. I stood in my kitchen reading the complaint while wearing the same Yale Law sweatshirt I'd hidden in my closet for a decade, and made my decision. I would represent myself. "You need a lawyer," Mrs. Chen said when she stopped by with casserole and concern. Victoria's husband knows every judge in the county. I'll be fine, I said, accepting the casserole with genuine gratitude. What I didn't say was that I knew those judges, too. Had sat beside them at judicial conferences, debated procedure with them over coffee, earned their respect through decisions that still stood as precedent. They knew me by a different title then, one that commanded immediate recognition in any courtroom in Massachusetts. I pulled out my old briefcase from the closet, the leather soft with age, my initials barely visible, Hunter M. Thompson. Inside, yellowed but still valid, lay my federal court identification, my bar certificate, and a photograph from my swearing-in ceremony. Chief Justice Patterson shaking my hand, the future unlimited. They wanted a show. I'd give them justice. If you've ever been underestimated because of the sacrifices you made for family, please leave a comment below. Sometimes our greatest strength lies in what we choose not to showcase. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the most intense part. When I walked into that courtroom with 200 eyes waiting to watch me crumble. Trust me, what happens next will remind you that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. Suffolk County Superior Court's courtroom. One hadn't seen crowds like this since the Big Dig corruption trials. 200 seats, all filled. Victoria had made sure of that. Partners from Boston's top firms, legal reporters, even law students from Harvard taking notes for their ethics classes. This would be a masterclass in destroying a fraudulent heir. Victoria entered like visiting royalty in her St. John knit suit, the coral pink that photographed beautifully. David beside her and charcoal Tom Ford, their legal team flowing behind them like a designer army. They took the plaintiff's table with practice choreography, briefcases snapping open in unison, leather and gold catching the light from the 100-year-old windows. I arrived alone, carrying the same canvas bag I used for grocery shopping, wearing my mother's navy dress from 1995. The whispers started immediately. That's her? She couldn't even hire a lawyer? This will be over in minutes. Then Judge Robert Brennan entered, and I saw the exact moment recognition flickered across his face. His stride faltered for just a heartbeat as his eyes found mine. We'd served together on the Federal Appeals Court Nomination Committee 12 years ago. He'd called my opinion in Thompson v. Massachusetts the most elegant legal reasoning he'd seen in a decade. But he said nothing, taking his seat beneath the Commonwealth seal, his expression carefully neutral. Victoria smiled at David, the kind of smile that said the game was already won. She didn't notice how Judge Brennan's fingers drummed once against his bench, the same nervous tell he'd had during difficult deliberations. Hayes v. Thompson, matter of Charles Thompson's estate, the clerk announced. All parties present? David Hayes for the plaintiff, David stood, his voice filling the room with practiced authority. I rose slowly. Margaret Thompson, pro se, Your Honor. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Brennan's eyes widened, just slightly. David commanded the courtroom like a conductor with a symphony of humiliation. His PowerPoint presentation filled the screen, 50 slides of evidence designed to paint me as a calculating manipulator who'd imprisoned a sick old man for his money. Your Honor, he began, his Mont Blanc laser pointer drawing circles around a photo of me at the grocery store. Margaret Thompson has no documented income for the past decade, no employment history, no professional references. Yet she somehow convinced a man suffering from advanced Parkinson's to leave her $50 million. Slide 20 showed Victoria at a charity gala, radiant and successful. Slide 21 showed me in sweatpants taking out garbage. The contrast was deliberate, cruel, effective. The gallery murmured appreciation for the theatrical presentation. Victoria took the witness stand with practiced grace, tissues ready for strategic deployment. Margaret isolated our father, she said, voice breaking perfectly. Whenever I tried to visit, she'd say he was too tired, too sick. She controlled his medications, his visitors, his entire world. And she never even finished using her law degree. What kind of person gets into law school and then just gives up? Objection, I said quietly. Speculation and improper characterization. David smirked. Your Honor, perhaps someone should explain to Ms. Thompson that this isn't a television show. We follow actual legal procedure here. The gallery laughed. Victoria dabbed her eyes with satisfaction. Judge Brennan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I withdrew my objection, I said, making a note on my legal pad. Let them exhaust their ammunition first. For 90 minutes, they painted me as a parasite, a failure, a nobody who'd stolen from a war hero's daughter. The crowd ate it up, some literally taking photos despite the court's prohibition. Victoria's Instagram followers would feast on this destruction. David's finale was magnificent. We request the court invalidate this fraudulent will immediately. David's next witness was Dr. Sarah Brennan, no relation to the judge, who'd evaluated Dad once, 5 years ago. Classic signs of cognitive decline, she testified, though she admitted under my brief cross-examination that she'd only spent 30 minutes with him. Then came 3 of Victoria's friends, each testifying how strange and controlling I'd seemed at Dad's birthday parties. Margaret never let anyone speak to Charles alone, testified Jennifer Walsh, Victoria's Harvard roommate. It was deeply concerning. The momentum was entirely theirs. I could feel the gallery's sentiment shifting from curiosity to conviction. Poor Victoria, trying to save her father's legacy from her predator sister. Even court security seemed to eye me with suspicion. Ms. Thompson, Judge Brennan finally addressed me, his tone formal, distant. Do you have any witnesses to call? Not at this time, Your Honor. David actually laughed. Your Honor, the defendant appears to have no defense whatsoever. I move for immediate summary judgment. Victoria smiled triumphantly, already texting someone under the table. The gallery buzzed with anticipation of the final blow. A Reuters reporter was typing furiously. This would make the evening news cycle. Judge Brennan studied me for a long moment. Ms. Thompson, you're representing yourself. The court wants to ensure you understand the gravity of these proceedings. Do you wish to present any evidence in your defense? I stood slowly, reaching for my canvas bag. Your Honor, I have just a few documents to submit. A few documents? David scoffed. Your Honor, this is clearly a delay tactic from someone who— Mr. Hayes, Judge Brennan's voice carried a warning. The defendant has the right to present evidence. I pulled out a manila folder, worn at the edges. Your Honor, may I approach? The truth has perfect timing, and timing, as any good judge knows, is everything. Your Honor, may I approach? I repeated, holding the manila folder. Judge Brennan nodded, and I walked forward, my mother's dress rustling in the silence. The bar between the gallery and the court felt familiar under my palm. I'd crossed it thousands of times, just never from this side. First, I'd like to submit my bar license for the record, I said, handing over the document. Active status, Massachusetts Bar number 2847. David stood immediately. So what? Lots of housewives have old bar licenses they keep active for vanity. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The number, Mr. Hayes, Judge Brennan interrupted, studying the document. His fingers had stopped drumming. Are you familiar with what bar numbers below 3,000 indicate in Massachusetts? David's confidence flickered. Victoria leaned forward, whispering urgently to her associate, who began frantically searching on their laptop. They indicate admission to the bar prior to 1995, I answered for him. When the state required not just passage of the exam, but also judicial clerkship and special recommendation from the Board of Bar Overseers, the standards that were discontinued for being, quote, excessively restrictive. I pulled out the second document. This is my law degree, Yale, 1994, summa cum laude, Order of the Coif, Law Review Editor-in-Chief. I paused. The year before Victoria entered Harvard. The gallery had gone completely silent. Someone in the back row whispered, "Check LinkedIn," followed by frantic phone scrolling. Your Honor, I continued, pulling out a leather-bound volume, I'd also like to submit a copy of Thompson v. Massachusetts, a 2014 landmark decision on inheritance law and undue influence. You might find the case particularly relevant, as it established the precedent that cognitive decline must be definitively proven at the time of will execution, not presumed from a later diagnosis. "I'm familiar with the case," Judge Brennan said slowly. "Intimately familiar." I opened the leather-bound volume to the title page. "If Your Honor would note the presiding judge's name." Judge Brennan read aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "The Honorable Margaret Thompson, United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts." The sound that rippled through the gallery was like wind through autumn leaves, 200 people inhaling simultaneously. Victoria's face drained of color so completely that her coral suit seemed to glow against her pallor. "That's..." David's voice cracked. "That's impossible. There must be another Margaret Thompson." "Born February 15th, 1982? I asked. "Graduated Yale Law, 1994, Harvard Judicial Clerkship, 1995, appointed to the federal bench at age 29? I turned to Judge Brennan. "Your Honor knows what bar number 2847 means because you have bar number 2851. We took the exam the same year." "Jesus Christ," someone whispered in the gallery. A phone clattered to the floor. Judge Brennan set down the document with extraordinary care. "Judge Thompson," he said, and the title rang through the courtroom like a bell. "Margaret, I haven't seen you since Dad got sick," I said simply. 10 years ago, right after the Patterson nomination committee. I submitted my resignation the next day." Victoria found her voice, though it came out strangled. "You're not a judge. You can't be. You were just..." "Just what, Victoria?" I turned to face her for the first time. "Just the sister who cooked your graduation dinner while you gave speeches about being the first lawyer in the family? Just the one who held Dad's hand through 3,000 medical appointments while you built your reputation?" My phone buzzed. An email notification flashed on the screen, visible to anyone watching. From Chief Justice Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. "Your Honor," I said, "I have additional evidence to present." "The Thompson versus Massachusetts decision," I continued, holding up the bound volume, "established 3 critical precedents. First, that testamentary capacity must be proven incompetent at the exact time of will execution. Second, that family members claiming undue influence bear the burden of proof. And third," I looked directly at Victoria, "that accusations of fraud without evidence constitute defamation per se." Judge Brennan was reading ahead in the decision, his expression shifting from recognition to something approaching awe. "This case, you wrote this when you were 31. It's been cited over 300 times. It's required reading at Harvard Law." "What?" Victoria's voice broke completely. "That's my law school. I studied that case. Professor Williams said the judge was brilliant, that they were being considered for..." She stopped, the implications crashing over her. "For the First Circuit Court of Appeals," Judge Brennan finished. "You were on the short list, Margaret. Everyone knew you were heading for the Supreme Court eventually." David had dropped his laser pointer. It rolled across the floor, the sound enormous in the silence. "Your Honor, we need a recess. This information changes. We need to verify..." "What you need to verify," I said, pulling out another document, "is this cognitive evaluation of Charles Thompson, dated 3 years ago, performed by Dr. Michael Roberts, Chief of Neurology at Johns Hopkins." I handed it to the clerk. "Dad scored 29 out of 30 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, completely competent. The will was executed 2 days after this evaluation." The Reuters reporter was standing now, phone pressed to her ear, speaking urgently. The law students were frantically photographing their notes. Someone in the back row said, loud enough to carry, "She gave up a federal judgeship to change bedpans?" "Objection!" David shouted, though there was nothing to object to. Victoria was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Judge Brennan stood. The gesture was so unexpected that the bailiff stepped forward in confusion. Judges don't stand during proceedings. But Robert Brennan wasn't just acknowledging a lawyer. He was recognizing a colleague whose reputation had become legend in her absence. Judge Thompson, he said, his voice thick with something between respect and regret. Margaret, is it really you? When you disappeared, we thought, Patterson said you'd had a family emergency, but then you never came back. The Second Circuit position, the Supreme Court clerkship, Justice Ginsburg personally recommended you for— Hello, Robert, I said quietly. Yes, it's me. The gallery erupted. Phones appeared despite the prohibition, photos snapping, texts flying. Federal judge and Supreme Court ricocheted through the crowd like bullets. A Harvard law student actually stood on his seat for a better view. David grabbed Victoria's arm, whispering furiously. She shook him off, standing unsteadily. You're not— You can't be. I would have known. Dad would have told me. Dad knew, I said. He knew exactly who was reading him briefs every night, who was discussing constitutional law with him at 3 a.m. when the pain kept him awake, who was using her legal expertise to navigate his healthcare appeals, his estate planning, his final years with dignity. Judge Brennan slowly sat back down, his composure visibly shaken. The Massachusetts legal community mourned your loss, Margaret. Your decision in Rodriguez versus Commonwealth is still the gold standard for judicial reasoning, and you just walked away? I walked towards something more important, I said, then turned back to the court. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because my sister accused me of fraud, so let me present my final piece of evidence. I pulled out my phone, connecting it to the courtroom's display system. A video deposition from Charles Thompson himself. 10 years ago, I was the youngest federal judge in Massachusetts history, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned courtroom. Appointed at 29 after clerking for Justice Patterson, I had a trajectory that most lawyers dream about: Second Circuit Court of Appeals, potential Supreme Court clerkship, maybe even the Supreme Court itself someday. I pulled out a photograph from my folder, me shaking hands with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg at my swearing-in ceremony. Justice Ginsburg wrote my recommendation letter personally. She called me the future of progressive judicial thought. Victoria sank into her chair, her St. John's suit suddenly looking like costume armor that had failed her. Then Dad got sick, I continued. Advanced Parkinson's, aggressive progression. Victoria was in New York, making senior partner. She visited 3 times that first year. I watched Dad try to button his shirt for 40 minutes, refusing help because he didn't want to be a burden. That's when I made my choice. You could have hired help, David interjected weakly. Used your salary to— I could have, I agreed. But Dad didn't need an employee. He needed family. He needed someone who understood that his mind was still brilliant, even as his body failed. Someone who could discuss his cases, help him feel valuable, connected to the world he'd built. I looked at the gallery, recognizing several retired judges, former colleagues. Power isn't about titles or positions. It's about choices. I chose Dad. I chose 10 years of medication schedules and physical therapy and sleepless nights. I chose to let Victoria have the spotlight she needed so desperately after losing Mom. I chose to be forgotten by everyone in this room. Judge Brennan's voice was rough. Margaret, I had no idea. If we'd known, you'd have tried to talk me out of it. And maybe you'd have succeeded. That's why I disappeared completely. The courtroom screen flickered to life. Dad appeared, sitting in his study 3 years ago. His hands showed slight tremor, but his eyes were sharp, alert, fully present. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., March 15, 2021, 2 days after his cognitive evaluation. My name is Charles Benjamin Thompson, he began, his voice strong. I am 78 years old, former CEO of Boston Private Bank, and I am recording this video to accompany my last will and testament. Victoria made a sound like she'd been punched. I am of sound mind, as verified by Dr. Roberts at Johns Hopkins. I make this recording freely, without coercion, in the presence of my attorney James Morrison and his associate Patricia Chen as witnesses. The camera panned briefly to show both lawyers nodding. Dad continued, 10 years ago, my daughter Margaret resigned from her position as a federal judge to care for me. She never told me, but I knew. I had friends in the courthouse. They told me she was brilliant, destined for the Supreme Court. Instead, she chose to spend her nights reading me briefs, her days managing my medications, her career sacrificed on the altar of family duty. His voice cracked slightly. Victoria visited when convenient. She sent flowers, hired nurses I didn't want, and posted photos on social media of the devoted daughter. But Margaret held my hand through every seizure, every moment of terror when I couldn't remember my own name. She gave up everything and never once complained or told anyone what she'd sacrificed. Dad looked directly into the camera. I leave my estate to Margaret not because Victoria doesn't deserve it, but because Margaret already paid for it, with 10 years of her life. The $1 million I leave Victoria comes with my love, but also my hope that she'll understand. Some things are worth more than money or status. Silent sacrifice often goes unnoticed until it's too late. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever watched someone mistake your kindness for weakness, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next, the secret clause in Dad's will that Victoria triggered by suing me, changes everything. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's justice written in advance. I opened the email on my phone, projecting it onto the courtroom screen. The Supreme Judicial Court seal filled the display, followed by the message that had arrived during Victoria's testimony. From Chief Justice Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts, Supreme Judicial Court, to Honorable Margaret Thompson. Date, today's date, 11:47 a.m. Dear Margaret, word has reached us that you're appearing in Suffolk Superior Court today. Bob Brennan called during recess. He was shaking when he recognized you. We've kept your position on the First Circuit open for 3 years, hoping you might return. Patterson never accepted your resignation, just marked you on indefinite family leave. The legal community has followed Thompson v. Massachusetts and your other decisions through citations and law review articles. Your absence left a void we've never been able to fill. If you're ready to return, we're ready to welcome you back. The oath you took doesn't expire, Margaret. Neither does our respect for your sacrifice. With profound admiration, Elizabeth Warren, Chief Justice. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the court reporter's fingers frozen above her keys. A former state attorney general in the gallery whispered, "My God, they held her position for 13 years?" Victoria was crying now, real tears, not the strategic ones from earlier. You were a federal judge? A real one, and you gave it up for Dad, Eve? I gave it up for family, I corrected. The same family that's now suing me for fraud. David tried one last desperate attempt. This changes nothing legally. The will can still be contested on grounds of... Mr. Hayes, I interrupted, pulling out the final document. Before you continue, you should know about Article 7, Section B of the will. The no contest clause your wife triggered when she filed this lawsuit. Victoria's hands shook as she reached for the water pitcher. She missed, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gavel. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible even with the courtroom's acoustics. Margaret, I didn't know any of this. You were always just there, in the kitchen, in Dad's room, in the background. David tried to salvage something, anything. Your Honor, this is all very touching, but my client was never informed about her sister's previous career. This concealment itself could be considered... What, David? I turned to face him directly. Fraud? I never lied. Victoria never asked. She never wondered how I could read Dad's medical charts, navigate insurance appeals, understand the legal implications of every document. She was too busy posting Instagram stories about being a self-made success to notice that someone else had unmade themselves for her father. The gallery was shifting now, phones recording despite repeated bailiff warnings. The Harvard law students were openly gaping. The Reuters reporter had stopped typing, just staring. There's one more document, I said, returning to my canvas bag. An email from Dad to James Morrison, dated the same day as the video. I read aloud. James, if Victoria contests this will, she proves she learned nothing from me about family, sacrifice, or love. The no contest clause isn't punishment, it's a final lesson. Margaret gave up her career without anyone asking. Victoria won't even give up a lawsuit when everyone's watching. Victoria stood abruptly, her designer heels catching in her chair. Stop. Please, just stop. But I wasn't done. Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that by filing this lawsuit, Mrs. Thompson Hayes has forfeited her inheritance under Article 7, Section B. No! Victoria lunged forward. I withdraw the lawsuit. I withdraw everything. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Judge Brennan said quietly. I pulled out Dad's will, turning to the tabbed page. Article 7, Section B, the No Contest Clause. Any beneficiary who directly or indirectly contests this will, challenges the mental capacity of the testator, or claims undue influence against any other beneficiary, shall forfeit all rights to any inheritance, including specifically the $1 million set aside for Victoria Thompson Hayes. The language was surgical, drafted by Morrison with the precision of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by greed. I continued reading. This clause is triggered upon the filing of any legal action, regardless of subsequent withdrawal or dismissal. Your Honor, David's voice cracked as he stood. Surely there must be some consideration for the fact that my client was unaware. Unaware of what, Mr. Hayes? Judge Brennan's patience had clearly expired. The clause was in the will she received. She signed acknowledgement of receipt 3 weeks ago. He held up a copy with Victoria's signature, notarized and dated. She chose to file anyway. Victoria collapsed into her chair. $1 million. Gone? Gone the moment you filed, I confirmed. Dad knew you'd do this. He knew you'd see my inheritance as theft rather than payment for services you never bothered to recognize. The million wasn't a gift, Victoria. It was a test. The gallery erupted. She lost everything, someone said. $1 million for ego, another voice added. The law students were furiously scribbling notes for what would undoubtedly become case study material. Morrison's associate, Patricia Chen, stood in the gallery. Your Honor, I can confirm the no contest clause was explained in detail to Mrs. Thompson Hayes when she received her copy of the will. She told us, and I quote, I don't care about clauses. That money is mine by right. Victoria's St. John's suit suddenly looked like she was drowning in coral-colored water. Judge Brennan straightened his robes, his voice taking on the formal cadence of judicial pronouncement. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds no grounds for challenging the last will and testament of Charles Benjamin Thompson. The testator was demonstrably competent at the time of execution. The claims of undue influence are not only unsupported but contradicted by clear evidence. He paused, looking directly at Victoria. Furthermore, this court recognizes that Margaret Thompson, a former federal judge who sacrificed an extraordinary career to care for her father, has been subjected to public humiliation and baseless accusations of fraud. The no contest clause, having been triggered by the plaintiff's filing, is hereby enforced. The gavel came down with finality. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. The estate of Charles Thompson shall be distributed according to the terms of his will, with the exception that Victoria Thompson Hayes forfeits all inheritance rights as specified in Article 7, Section B. Your Honor, David made one last desperate attempt. The legal fees alone for this case are your responsibility, Mr. Hayes, Judge Brennan interrupted. You filed a frivolous lawsuit without proper investigation. By my calculation, you've involved 5 attorneys, 3 firms, and approximately, he glanced at the paperwork, 200 billable hours. At your firm's rates, that's roughly $500,000 in legal fees. I hope your malpractice insurance is current. Victoria let out a sound between a sob and a laugh. $500,000? David, we can't. Additionally, Judge Brennan continued, given the public nature of these proceedings, which the plaintiff specifically requested, this ruling will be entered into public record. The Massachusetts Bar Association will be notified of the conduct displayed here today. David's face went from red to white to gray in the span of 3 seconds. A managing partner who'd just lost a very public case based on zero evidence. His career trajectory had just reversed itself spectacularly. The courtroom doors hadn't even closed before the dominoes started falling. David's phone exploded with calls. I could see the names flashing. Managing partner, executive committee, PR crisis team. He fumbled to silence it, dropping it twice. A woman in the gallery stood, Judith Blackstone, senior partner at Blackstone and Associates, one of Victoria's biggest clients. Mrs. Hayes, in light of today's revelations, will be reviewing our representation agreement. She left without waiting for a response. 2 more clients followed her out. The Reuters reporter was already on live broadcast from the courthouse steps. In an extraordinary reversal, what began as a bitter inheritance dispute has revealed that the defendant, Margaret Thompson, is actually former federal judge Margaret Thompson, who gave up a Supreme Court trajectory to care for her ailing father. Victoria's phone buzzed with notifications. Her face crumpled as she read them. "The partnership committee wants an emergency meeting," she whispered to David. "They're questioning my judgment, my ethics." "Mine too," David muttered, reading his own messages. "They're discussing whether this constitutes conduct unbecoming a managing partner." From the gallery, a voice called out, one of the Harvard law students. "Judge Thompson, would you consider guest lecturing about judicial ethics?" Another voice. "Judge Thompson, the First Circuit position, will you accept?" But I wasn't looking at them. I was watching Victoria, my little sister, who'd built her entire identity on being the successful one, the chosen one, the daughter who made Dad proud. She looked smaller now, her designer armor cracked, revealing the scared 8-year-old who'd lost her mother too soon. "Margaret," she said, her voice small, "what do I do now?" For the first time in 10 years, I didn't have to hide my strength to protect her ego. "You learn, Victoria. Finally, you learn." 6 months have passed since that day in court. I declined the First Circuit position, respectfully, gratefully, but firmly. Power isn't about returning to old titles. It's about choosing your own path. Instead, I established the Charles Thompson Foundation for Family Caregivers with $25 million of Dad's money. We provide legal assistance, financial support, and respite care for people who sacrifice careers to care for loved ones. People who are invisible until they're gone. I kept Dad's house in Beacon Hill, converting it into the Foundation's headquarters. His study, where we discussed constitutional law through long, painful nights, is now a library for caregivers seeking legal resources. The kitchen where I prepared 17,000 meals is now a conference room where families plan care strategies without shame. Victoria sent an email last month, her first contact since the trial. No more designer letterhead, just a Gmail account. She apologized, genuinely this time. Said she'd been in therapy, learning about grief, about how she'd turned achievement into armor against the pain of losing Mom. How she'd resented me for being older, stronger, able to remember Mom when she couldn't. I accepted her apology, but maintained boundaries. "You're still my sister, Victoria, but respect is earned, not inherited. Trust is rebuilt through actions, not words." She's volunteering at the foundation now, 2 hours every Saturday. No Instagram posts about it, no LinkedIn updates, just quiet service, learning what sacrifice actually looks like. David left her, couldn't handle the professional humiliation. She kept his name, though, as a reminder, she said, of who I don't want to be anymore. Last week, she brought coffee and sat quietly while I reviewed grant applications. "I understand now," she said. "You chose Dad. You chose love." "I chose myself," I corrected. "The self that valued love over laurels." I'm writing the story from Dad's old study, now my office at the foundation. Justice Ginsburg's photo sits on my desk next to one of Dad and me from his last Christmas. his hand steady in mine, both of us smiling genuinely. No performance, no pretense, just presence. The legal community still sends offers, speaking engagements, consulting positions, even a book deal from Random House about women who leave prestigious careers for family. The advance would be $500,000. I'm considering it, not for the money, but for the message. Your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it. I was no less valuable changing Dad's sheets than I was writing judicial opinions. The 10 years I spent invisible weren't lost years. They were invested years. Invested in love, in dignity, in the kind of wealth that doesn't appear on bank statements. Victoria asked me once if I regret giving up the Supreme Court trajectory. I told her the truth. I made a choice with complete information and full agency. Regret requires wishing you'd chosen differently. I don't. What I learned in those 10 years of silence is this: the strongest position is knowing your worth without needing to prove it. The greatest power is choosing your battles, not winning everyone thrust upon you. And sometimes, the most profound justice is written not in courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when you choose love over law, family over fame, service over status. Dad knew who I was all along. He saw me not as the daughter who gave up everything, but as the daughter who understood what everything really meant. His will wasn't about money, it was about recognition, about seeing the invisible, about honoring the sacrifice that never asks for honor. The strongest among us don't always roar. Sometimes we whisper, sometimes we're silent, sometimes we just hold the hand that needs holding. This story reminds us that sacrifice isn't weakness, it's the ultimate strength. If you've ever been underestimated for choosing family over career, love over ambition, please share your story in the comments. Subscribe if you believe that real power comes from knowing your worth, not proving it. And remember, the people who truly see you don't need you to wear your resume. Thank you for listening. I'm Margaret Thompson, and this is my truth.